So everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the geopolitics of the Hamas-Israel war. The IISS hosting this because of the urgency of the situation and the dramatic nature of what happened last Saturday is carrying on throughout Israel and the Gaza. With me today are four experts from the IISS who are going to take you through individually some points for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions. There is the Q&A button at the bottom, and you can use that to ask questions, and that would be the best way, and then I can field them from there. So I'll just go around it as a brief introduction. You've seen them, John Raine, the IISS Senior Advisor for Geopolitical Due Diligence, Emile Hokayem, who's the Director of Regional Security, but also leads the Middle East program in its entirety, Rym Momtaz, another one of the IISS senior advisors, consulting senior advisor, and Hasan AlHasan, who is the research fellow for Middle East policy based in Bahrain. And with no further ado, because we have 1 hour for this, I'm going to go straight into it and ask John to kick off.
Thank you, Tom. I'll start just by recapping on the strategic challenges that Israel faces at the moment. I think that might help us understand what the likely course and duration of this conflict will be. First of all, Israel has to neutralize an immediate threat to the settlements and to its population. And in order to do that, it has to break the capabilities of its adversary. That requires use of massive force. And there are other drivers for the use of massive force, not least the second principal objective, which is reassurance of the population. Thirdly, this strategic objective is, I think, going to be the most difficult one for Israel's allies, and that is to deny Hamas its operational habitat. I pick my words very carefully here, because Hamas is an organization tied very closely to its habitat. It is not a dispersed and mobile organization such as Al-Qaeda, and is not territorially expansive or mobile such as Daesh. It's located in, thrives on a particular location and topography. We have already heard some indications from the Israeli side that they intend to make permanent changes to the conflict and indeed to their adversary. I believe this could entail changes to the topography of Gaza, and the most recent announcement in the last 24 hours suggests that that may be where they're heading. So that's the third strategic objective, deny operational habitat to Hamas. The fourth is to contain the spread of the conflict. And Israeli priorities here, I think, are West Bank, Northern Front, and then Israeli interests overseas. So each of those is going to require a different response. Each of them is very much a different kind of threat. But the Israelis have a playbook for each of those, and I think we'll see that roll out not in sequence, but at exactly the same time, because they will be acutely aware that what they do in the West Bank increases the likelihood of any one of those fronts igniting. I mean, just colleagues will talk in more depth, I think, about this, but particularly focused on the West Bank at the moment for the Israelis, that's the priority, that's where the majority of the settlements are. So this has become increasingly a question for Netanyahu and the security establishment, including the IDF, their credibility as the national defensive force, in particular for settlements. So a couple of strategic considerations that flow from that. Will this be an internationalized conflict? I think the Israeli desire will be very much for it not to be, other than for the continuing flow of aid from the US. That has already begun. Other countries, including the UK, have offered. But the Israelis will seek to own and dominate the battle space. Don't want other actors in it. On the side of Hamas, however, we have seen an attempt at least to enkindle sympathy through popular demonstrations, popular manifestations in other countries And we've seen reciprocal demonstrations from sympathizers and also most notably from Iran, which again we'll talk about later. But Hamas's objective here will be to draw in both material aid and diplomatic and moral support. So there's going to be a tension, there's a fight there over internationalizing this. Personally, I think the only international dimension that we will see will be external targeting, both of Israelis targeting Hamas. I think they will cast their net very wide and target Hamas's supporters and leadership. I think we'll also see some internationalization, as we already have done, sadly, targeting of Jewish interests overseas. So the question for me is whether Israel's 9/11 entails also an Israeli decades-long GWOT. And if we do regard this as a 9/11 type attack, both in its scale and its nature, a heavily resourced asymmetric actor, puncturing a state's defences, then there is a very strong likelihood that what we see unfold will resemble what we saw after 9/11. So just to remind ourselves what the characteristics of that, this is a war fought over time. So after the initial use of massive force to reassure, to break capabilities, I think we will see sustained degradation of Hamas and affiliated organisations. That will require, again, just reminding ourselves what the GWOT required, it requires an intense and constantly refreshed intelligence base. The absence of that is an acute embarrassment to the Israelis. So we'll see a renewal of their intelligence capabilities. I think at the moment they will lean out to partners to assist with that, particularly on Hamas. But this will be a feature of the ongoing, of the long tail of this. And also, I think we can expect to see much more selective kinetic activity as the target base is refreshed. It's going to be very difficult to agree with the Israelis an end point for this conflict. They haven't given any indication what constitutes success. There may be significant redeployments made for military reasons, but I think they will want to keep this open-ended until they have reached what they believe is effective decapitation and disablement of Hamas. So those are my views on the likely nature of the conflict. Tom, back to you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm not going to interpose with any questions, and I'm not going to field any from our webinar guests at this stage, because I want to go around and get all of our pieces out first. So, Emile, if I could turn to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to offer 2 points about regional implications and one about more broader geopolitical ones. There are 2 countries right now that can legitimately say, "We told you so," and that's Jordan and Egypt, who had in the past few years felt that the focus on the normalization track between Israel and important countries in the region and possibly Saudi Arabia came as a distraction from very troublesome dynamics on the ground. 2022 and 2023, up until last Saturday, were already the most violent years to date since the end of the Second Intifada, 2000-2005. And these are 2 countries with deep intelligence, but also societal ties to respectively Gaza and the West Bank. And they were genuinely concerned, whether they saw something coming, whether there were intelligence warnings. We'll see in coming days what surfaces. But they certainly had a political appreciation for what was happening. And they grew quite concerned. Netanyahu was a very difficult interlocutor for them compared to the 2 Israeli prime ministers who succeeded each other just before, Lapid and Bennett. Now, these are 2 countries that have called immediately for de-escalation and are using every channel they have to the Israelis, but also to Westerners, other Arabs, and so on, to push in this direction. However, I think they realize that for Israel, regional and reputational considerations come second or third after what we already said, which is restoring deterrence, providing reassurance to the population, etc. So I think their leverage is quite limited, except if the issue of hostages, and we'll come back to that, becomes a prominent one, in which case they could play a lead. Why is that? Because if you're Egypt, the biggest security threat of the past decade has been instability in the Sinai. Extremist groups, criminal groups, but also local tribal groups feeling excluded. And that instability fed and was fed by Gaza in a way. There was weapon smuggling, there were militants coming on the other side, there was, saying so Egypt doesn't want to see greater instability in the Sinai. More importantly, and that's very current, given the Israeli warning to over 1 million Palestinians in Gaza to flee their houses in northern Israel, is like, where do they go? And the suggestion in Israel is, well, let them cross into Egypt or Jordan. Well, Egypt and Jordan have hosted Palestinian refugees for a very long time and have been told they would come back and once a solution was done, and they haven't. So they don't want to see what is already called in the Arab world the second Nakba, in another massive influx of refugees that in turn fuels, domestic instability and makes those countries feel very weak, almost humiliated, vulnerable to Israeli policy choices. So there is a big pushback in Amman and Cairo against any idea of opening borders because of that. Now, obviously, there's a humanitarian impulse on the other, so it's going to be extremely difficult for the authorities in Jordan and Egypt to explain what they're doing, and I suspect they will want to facilitate aid into Gaza in a way to alleviate the pressure and place themselves, but that also means that they have to have control over their borders. On the Israeli side, Israel can easily interrupt flow into the West Bank from Jordan. The Egyptians have a bit more control over the Rafah So keep an eye on those two countries, because especially Jordan, which remains a key Western partner, and is quite exposed on every border at this point. The second set of regional players to watch carefully are Turkey and Qatar, which have maintained quite good relations with Hamas over time. I wouldn't put them in the same category as Iran in terms of sponsorship. There's no evidence of weapons or anything else. It's a largely political relationship, at least on the part of Qatar. With Turkey a bit deeper on the security side. But Iran remains the primary patron with Syria, Assad's Syria, and others. So, but the problem for these two countries is they've come under sustained criticism for their relationship with Hamas. They're seen as enablers of Hamas, as having provided money, provided legitimacy, provided a sense of depth. And for them, usually they like to play the mediator role. But in this specific case, it is both needed and extremely dangerous for them. This is not a situation where they would have to help de-escalate a limited war, providing incentives and reassurance, respectively to the Palestinians and then to the Israelis. It's an all-out war, a ground intervention. It's going to be that will inflame their populations, their media, and so on. The second aspect is that we're not talking about 1 or 5 hostages to release and protracted negotiation over that. The number of hostages, the fact that it's going to be in the media all the time, is going to be very difficult to manage. And the risk for Doha and Ankara is that they may be manipulated by Hamas. They may want to play a role, and they will realize that they don't necessarily know this Hamas leadership that has taken the decision to escalate the way it did. The final point I'll make is on geopolitical implications. This crisis is yet a reminder that the Middle East is not, immune, doesn't operate on a different planet. I mean, in a way, tensions in the Middle East already have an impact, for instance, on the Russia-Ukraine element. If there are not yet another front that the Americans have to resource and service, these are resources or aircraft carriers or intelligence attention and so on that has to be spent elsewhere. Importantly, though, there is another interesting entanglement to watch, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu may well, in his effort to neutralize a northern front, decide that the person to talk to is Vladimir Putin, whose military presence in Syria and political influence there, and in developing relationship with Iran, with procurement of UAVs and others, is the person who can somehow restrain Iran and Syria and Hezbollah. And that's going to lead to some uncomfortable, awkward conversations because Netanyahu may want Putin's help and may want the Americans or others to tone it down on Russia because the priority right now is to avoid an all-out regional war. I'm not saying that's the likeliest of scenario. I'm just saying that it just illustrates that these are quite complex dynamics at play. So let me end here, but plenty on the table to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll go straight over to Rym.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks, Emile, for that actually great segue. I'm just going to discuss three main things: Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and obviously they're all connected. Just to start with Hamas and their external signaling, it's been very different than in previous rounds. The way the Hamas leadership has decided to signal and communicate to the world. We saw at the beginning one of the top Hamas leaders in Lebanon say very early on, 2 or 3 days in, to the BBC that Iran had provided direct support for this attack. That was not something anyone was expecting. They then walked it back. Other Hamas leaders did, but it was something to keep in mind. Then we had another Hamas high-level official who yesterday or before yesterday gave an interview to Russia Today, and the choice of Russia Today is not neutral, and sort of goes back to what Emile was just talking about. And very interestingly, he made a point to say that Hamas has a license to produce Kalashnikovs from Moscow, and that Russia was very happy with this war in Israel and supported Hamas because it would weaken the US support to Ukraine. That we have to keep in mind because Hamas is clearly trying to, at least on their level, present themselves as part of a wider axis, which brings me to Lebanon and Iran. We saw very quickly after we all heard about the attack, the Lebanon front start showing some skirmishes. At the beginning, it was limited mortar fire from Hezbollah on disputed territory, so the Sheba farms. So that is not Israeli territory, at least not settled by international law. And the response was quite limited at the beginning from Israel. But then in the following days, we saw what Hezbollah said was Palestinian armed factions opening fire from Lebanese territory in the south, which is controlled by Hezbollah onto Israel. And Israel's retaliation was on Hezbollah positions. So in a way, to go back to what John was saying, they are trying to restore their deterrence and they're trying to take back the initiative, which is also one of the reasons why Israel yesterday, for example, carried out strikes against the Damascus airport, just as the Iranian foreign minister had just landed in Baghdad and was headed to Beirut and to Damascus. And when Abdullahian landed in Beirut, he made some comments that are also important to keep in mind. Very interesting signaling. Of course, he said that he congratulates the Palestinian people on this operation, which he said was a response to Israel's war crimes, as he termed it. Of course, he didn't say Israel, he said the Zionist entity. Very interesting that they are attached to framing this as a response and not an offensive action. He then said that he, came to Lebanon in order to make sure that Lebanon remains safe and stable, and that is an objective of his visit. But that at the same time, if Israel continued its strikes and widened its strikes on Gaza, then the axis of resistance, as he put it, would have to open other fronts. We have never seen this kind of signaling and positioning in previous rounds. As you all know, there have been 5 wars in the past 15 years between Hamas and Israel, and none of them led to this kind of sequencing that we saw. 2 other things that have been interesting. One, today we heard from Total and Eni, who were doing exploration in offshore gas fields in Lebanon that are part of that Israeli American-Lebanese agreement that was reached earlier this year about sort of the gas exploration. Total said that the Block 9 on the Lebanese side doesn't have any gas. Will this change? Will this be one of the factors that might change the calculus of Hezbollah? That is something we have to keep an open mind on. And we saw also pressure from Congress on the U.S. administration to freeze the $6 billion that they had been unfreezing for Iran. So this is already taking on much bigger dimensions than we had seen before, perhaps because what we are seeing is a shift in paradigm, and some of the underlying calculus, at least on the side of Iran and its network of influence in the region, is still unknown to us. Perhaps the rules of engagement that have so far applied are changing. So we have to be very careful about trying to figure out what that calculus is. And we're seeing deterrence deployments by the US, by the UK, in the Mediterranean in a way we haven't seen before, which signals that these countries are clearly taking the possible opening of different fronts by Iran's network of influence very seriously. And I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you, Rym. Over to you, Hasan.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I'd like to analyze a slightly different set of actors to the ones which we've been discussing so far, namely the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, to be more precise. I think it's been fairly interesting to see what the Gulf states have had in common in terms of their response to the ongoing conflict so far, and that has been a call to prevent escalation. And to try and reach a ceasefire. And I think there is more than rhetoric to this. There's a real vested interest in preventing the conflict between Israel and Hamas from escalating into a regional war. I think on the one hand, the entanglement risk for the Gulf states is very real. Let's remember that the Gulf region normally hosts anywhere around 35,000 US troops that are deployed in the region. Qatar is home to the forward headquarters of the US Central Command, and Bahrain obviously hosts the US Fifth Fleet as well. And so if we were to see a nightmare scenario in which Iran, again, unlikely, but highly impactful, in which Iran becomes directly involved in the conflict, then, of course, Iran would have a very long list of hard and soft Western targets to choose from in the Gulf region. And this would obviously put the security of the Gulf states at direct risk. Not to mention, of course, the instability that this would cause in global oil markets. There are expectations by Bloomberg, for example, that if we were to see a wider regional war, that oil prices could climb up to $150 per barrel, which I can assure you is something that not even oil producers would want to see, because the impact on global economic growth would be highly significant. They estimate that at around taking off $1 trillion of world economic output off the table. That's so essentially a global recession. And so in a sense, there is a large degree of agreement on the need to de-escalate. Obviously, different Gulf states have different capacities to play a meaningful and significant role in bringing about that de-escalation. And so Emile described the latitude that Qatar might be able to exercise in trying to influence Hamas's decision to some extent because of the long-standing relationship. I think Qatar is fairly unique in that sense because most of the other Gulf states have almost no relationship to speak of with Hamas. On the other hand, I think Saudi Arabia has found somewhat of a niche in working the Iran channel. And so we saw the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, yesterday get on the phone with Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, the first ever call between the two leaders. And according to informal pro-Saudi accounts on Twitter, the call lasted for about 45 minutes. Whether or not that's true, in any case, it's a signal on the part of, it's a signal that this was a long and important discussion and that the Saudis are trying to do something to influence Iran's calculus. And so keep in mind that Saudi Arabia is one of the few I think countries that both has the ability to speak to the West and to Iran and to regional countries on this issue. However, it's important to keep in mind that there's also a significant degree of GCC unity beyond the call for de-escalation. And so we've seen the GCC states split into two camps. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar, very clearly identifying the Israeli occupation as the root cause of the violence, and arguing that in their statements that a viable Palestinian state, that a political resolution of this issue is the only viable way for a permanent resolution to the conflict. On the other hand, the Abraham Accord countries, the UAE and Bahrain, condemning Hamas's tactics, condoling Israel for the loss of life. With that in mind, Bahrain and the UAE are not immune to Arab or domestic public opinion, regardless of their statements. So we've seen Bahrain take a position against a statement by the US ambassador in Bahrain in which he claimed that Bahrain and the US were almost completely aligned on the conflict. And the Bahrainis, I think, were quick to distance themselves from that statement. Similarly, we've seen the UAE quick on its feet to react and to attempt to deny claims made by the Wall Street Journal that the US was using the Al Dhafra airbase to station military aircraft that could be used to support Israel. And I think this reflects a broader realization in the Gulf, whether by the UAE, Bahrain, or the rest of the Gulf states, that Arab public opinion, at the end of the day, Gulf public opinion, is firmly lined up behind the Palestinian cause. And they obviously have to take that into account in their own political calculations, which is why I think that Saudi-Israeli normalization is very much off the table at the moment. The domestic and regional political price that Riyadh would have to pay would be too steep, irrespective of the strategic benefits that could accrue to them. I'll leave it there for now.
That's brilliant, all of you. Thank you very much for that. There's a number of questions that have come in, and some have got a common theme. And so I think one of them, and Rym, you mentioned the restoring deterrence that the attack at Damascus had. John and Hasan, you've talked about de-escalation and the desire for that. Inevitably, what a couple of people have been asking is it a matter of time until Iran fully mobilizes its networks and this erupts into a regional war? And additionally, is it in Iran's interest to escalate the situation in the short term? And so perhaps, John, if you might possibly be able to give a perspective on that, maybe from thinking about it from Iran, and then Emile and Rym possibly from the Hezbollah angle.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. There's a genuinely difficult strategic decision for Tehran here. To escalate into a region-wide war using the full breadth and capabilities capabilities of its network of influence, that's possibly the final act for the regime, because the response would be unified and quite probably more than Iran could defend itself against, the regime could defend itself against. So at a time when they are economically and socially in a very uncertain position, this is a really difficult decision for the regime. And as colleagues have mentioned, everyone is picking their words very carefully here. And Rym is right, we're hearing things that we haven't heard before, but we're also not yet at the point where Emile Hokayem or any other senior figure in the leadership is saying, this is the time to escalate to a full-scale conflict against Israel and achieve some of those long-term ambitions which the Iranian regime has been structured around. I think that's deliberate. I think they want to leave themselves room for a range of responses which are definitely supportive, but maybe short of the assistance that they are being asked for, not just by Hamas, but by more radical members of their own organisations. So I think in answer to this, we will see probably a renewal of friction within agreed parameters on the north, and at the moment those parameters have held. It's fundamentally a tit-for-tat structure within which Hezbollah and Israel operate. I think that will, however, continue to see friction. There will be skirmishes there. And it would not surprise me if we saw some attempts elsewhere in the Middle East by Iran's partners to target either Israeli or pro-Israeli targets. But I think crossing from that into exchanges of fire between Iranian forces and Israeli forces, or even between Iranian and Israeli territory, I think that still would require a huge amount of strategic nerve by the regime in Tehran, and I'm not sure that they have it.
Thanks, John. And before Emile and Rym answer the piece about Hezbollah, there's been a follow-on question, which I think is pertinent in that it's taken that your assessment collectively is that this should remain contained because of the way that other actors or other nations are looking at it. But does that depend on the Israeli ground offensive in Gaza? And what would be where would be the trigger for it to be a case of catalyzing Hezbollah, for instance, to do something more about it?
Yeah. Just to build on this question and John's comments right now, when it comes to Hezbollah, it's important to understand where Hezbollah sits in the constellation of Iranian partners. Hezbollah is the most formidable and unique instrument of Iranian security policy. It is the ultimate tool of deterrence and punishment for Iran. And it's just so good for Iran that if you're sitting in Tehran, you probably want to deploy it only if the existence of the regime, the territorial integrity of Iran, the standing of its institutions and so on, is targeted in a way that feels existential. In 2006, Iran did not want the war. It was really an accidental war that took place, and I think in part Iran didn't want that war because it wasn't in a time and circumstances of its choosing. So Iran did not drive that escalation in 2006 mindlessly. It was very painful for the Lebanese. It had a cost for the Israelis as well. It was a humiliation for the Israeli military at the time. How the performance went about. But it was not an all-out war. I think the Iranians are quite careful, especially in this environment of heightened tensions. When you see how many Western countries have sided so clearly with Israel, it's a bit problematic for Iran. But at the same time, Iran may calculate that it is in a better geopolitical position globally. This rapprochement with China and Russia over the past couple of years makes many Iranian officials feel validated that, we started opposing the West 40 years ago, and The Russians and the Chinese joined the party late, but now, you know, there's this axis of rejectionist power, and Iran is firmly in there. So perhaps there is a layer of protection. I think there is another element, which is Iran feels more confident in the region. It has clearly rebounded from Qasem Soleimani's assassination. Its position in Iraq is not challenged. I mean, I don't know if you paid attention to Iraqi official statements. In Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon. So, you know, it came on top of that. And not only this, it has been able to essentially spook the Gulf states through the attacks of September 2019 against Saudi oil facilities and 2022 against UAE civilian targets and so on. So I think Iran feels regionally and geopolitically in a better place. Now, about the question about escalation, yes, how the war unfolds will matter massively. Whether Hamas is collapses quickly or it's able to put on a big fight, whether the amount of devastation that the Israelis impose on the Palestinians is broadcasted to the world and leads to immense suffering that will say all this does matter. I still think that the Iranians will make a cool strategic calculation at the end of the day. I'm not sure they're the most emotional people when it comes to this stuff. But look, it's not just our assessment as analysts or others. I mean, Tony Blinken, when he was in Israel, said how Israel does it matters. So I suspect there's even words of careful counsel coming from Western capitals to Israel and say it does matter how you go about that because it could lead to something much worse.
I'm just going to jump in quickly just to add to everything that John and Emile said, which I ascribe to. I think we shouldn't sort of underestimate the risk of miscalculation, which Emile has kind of touched upon with 2006. I am not sure that any one of us can actually respond today with certainty whether Hamas itself expected to be as successful as it was on Saturday, or whether, they launched this attack and what they were able to achieve surprised even them. And obviously the response and the retaliation that it now calls for is beyond what they were perhaps expecting. That's one possibility. And to this day, we have not been able to ascertain how involved Iran was in this planning and in this whole operation. Clearly, they are all brothers in arms. Clearly, they discuss and they cooperate. And they've been telling us publicly that they want to have a unity of fronts. And they've been publicly showing us that they have been meeting and helping each other and training. But does that mean that everyone was aware of the extent? We can't say for sure. The initial US intelligence assessment has not been able to say that with clarity yet, but they're still working on it. And just in terms of, quickly on Iran and how they're seeing this, I do have a question about whether they are seeing this as an opportunity to put in place sort of a new power dynamic, a new regional power balance. Are they seeing it as an opportunity? Did they think that Israel, with its internal domestic problems, was weakened enough for them to seize on the moment? Did they perhaps also see things that we don't know, that the sort of the Israeli-American Saudi track, was it evolved enough for them to start thinking about what could that mean for their own security? I'm asking open questions. We don't have answers to that, but it should be part of their calculus. And finally, has Hamas become important enough for this axis of resistance and its credibility as an axis of resistance, as they put it, for Iran to use other parts of its network of influence to save it if the Israeli retaliation looks to truly decapitate Hamas and take it out of the game? That's another open question, and I'll leave it there.
And that's excellent, Rym, because it takes me on to there are far too many questions for us to get through in an hour, and that's not surprising. But I'm going to group some of them. So, and Rym, I'm following on from what you said there, because the first part is there any indication that Israel has a plan for Gaza after the war? The second part of that is if the aim is to decapitate Hamas, what is the follow-on local administration? Is it possible that there could be a technocratic Gaza administration committee, and who constructs it? And that's an important question. Could it be constructed by the UN? Could it be constructed the Gulf Arab states with their support? And then to top that last one off, it's, as Israel hasn't yet declared its end state, given the shift to the right in Israeli politics, and a follow-on question could that be, is that shift to the right going to carry on after the post-war inquiry? Is there going to be an end state acceptable to Israel which does not remove the Palestinian territories of its identity? So I think, Hasan, I don't know if you want to have a go at some of those, and then we'll go around the table on that. So what happens after the decapitation of Hamas?
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I think it's extremely difficult at this stage to sort of peer into the unknown and look behind sort of the veil of the future, because the short answer is it depends. It depends on how Israel decides to go about implementing its strategy. I think the real question here is whether there is any viable military strategy short of a total ethnic cleansing of Gaza that would lead to a permanent defeat of Hamas, and that would not allow Hamas to regenerate in a generation or two. So we have to keep, I think, the political and social context into consideration, because the point is that it seems like Israel is walking into a trap set by Hamas. The use of tactics, the kind of tactics that Hamas has used, targeting civilians and so on, is, I think, precisely meant to prompt a disproportionate response on the part of the other party. And when that other party does that, that is exactly what happens. It leads to a cycle of violence and to a cycle of recruitment and so on. This is how groups like Hamas are able to survive for such a long time. It's because these cycles end up creating further radicalization and essentially recreates the social and political base through which it will be able to sustain itself. So I think we really have to ask ourselves, of course, Israeli leaders feel a domestic imperative. They feel the need to achieve a military victory, reassure the population, all of the objectives that John has described. But I think we have to take a step back and really ask the question as to whether there is a military option, whether there is really a viable military pathway that would lead to the kind of outcome that Israel is hoping to achieve. I don't think so. The other point, I think, is that this goes back to the question on Iran. The route to miscalculation, there's one route that Rym described. There's another route as well, which is the question of how much command and control Iran is able to exercise over its partner militias in the region. This is a question that has always haunted sort of the inquiry into Iran's power projection and armed non-state groups in the region. If the Iraqi militias decide to somehow escalate, or if the Houthis decide to escalate, the question is, will this be interpreted in the West, in the US, in Israel, as having been done at Iran's directive? Because that might not necessarily be the case. And so the question of the behavior of Iran's partner militias in the region, the question of how much that behavior will be a function of Iranian decision-making versus an autonomous decision that they could take for themselves, and then whether that could end up creating a miscalculation where we see an Israeli or Western retaliation against Iran for something that Iran may not have directly related. So there is a possibility for miscalculation there. I think the bottom line for me is that from the Iranian perspective, especially if Iran can avoid being dragged into this war, which I don't think Iran wants to be part of an open confrontation with Israel or the West. And if Iran manages to avoid that scenario, then I think from a political perspective, Iran is probably one of the biggest beneficiaries here. On the one hand, because the narrative of the axis of resistance that a military defeat of Israel is possible, that Israel is not militarily invincible, I think has been strengthened. But more interestingly, perhaps, is again the fact that the Hamas operation and Israel's response has probably set back Israel's normalization efforts many, many, many years. And if Israel does prosecute a very, let's say, escalatory, a very hard-headed military operation in Gaza with a massive humanitarian toll, then Israel will end up losing much of the international sympathy, especially in the West, that it has managed to get at this stage. So I think from the Iranian perspective, Israel is in a lose-lose situation. If it doesn't do anything, then, or if the response is not impactful enough, then it has incurred a defeat. It loses its image and so on. If Israel engages in a disproportionate response that has a massive impact on Palestinians, then it loses the international political battle and the battle for international political sympathy.
Thank you. I think we need to perhaps maybe bring in some of the economic aspect, the potential economic aspects of this. And one of the focused ones on that was, Rym, could you please clarify the comment on Block 9 and Hezbollah? Does that make them more likely to act? Maybe Hasan, you want to talk about, there's one, I don't personally see it myself, but is there a possibility of a new energy crisis such as like in 1973, and how could it unfold? And then we'll take you two first, and then we'll come back to some other questions. There are some about intelligence failures that we might touch upon as well with John Raine.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so quickly, Block 9 was the second block in the Lebanese sort of field as per the US brokered maritime deal between Israel and Lebanon. The first one was Block 4. It was explored. There was no gas in it. Block 9 now explored, no gas in it. The Lebanese, unfortunately, sort of leadership was pinning a lot of hopes on this block. They almost started sort of spending the money before even having it. So today's news is not good news. It doesn't automatically mean that Hezbollah is going to now want to go to war with Israel. To be quite frank, Emile and I have been leading sort of an ISIS-wide and a IISS-wide study on the geopolitics of and strategic competition of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this has been something that we've been looking at for the past year and a half, which, you know, we will be sort of launching at our Manama dialogue. And we sort of had doubts about whether this deal that had been reached between Lebanon and Hezbollah really and Israel over the gas fields could, you know, bring about a longer entente. And we had been saying in our report that it would be sort of very fragile and very frail because we didn't know what kind of reserves there are on the Lebanese side, whereas the Israeli side has proven reserves and has started exploring. So now, you know, the whole basis of that agreement from the American perspective was that by allowing both sides to benefit economically from this, then perhaps they could not shoot at each other, at least in that area, the maritime area. Whether now the Block 9 sort of exploration results changes that is definitely a factor that we have to take into consideration. But, you know, it's not a good development in this current context today, for sure.
Hasan, and then Emile, maybe you wanted to comment a little bit on some of the majors in that perspective.
Sure. So it was interesting to see at some stage a piece of disinformation online claiming that Qatar was contemplating cutting off gas supplies in retaliation to Israel's response, and I think if Israel embarked on a ground invasion. And obviously that was clearly a bit of disinformation that was meant to I think cause a degree of embarrassment and create a degree of uncertainty. I think the idea that we would see the oil or gas weapon being used by any of the regional countries is extremely unlikely. We are in uncharted territory, but I think that at this stage, the effectiveness, let alone any strategic calculus that would inform this, of the exercise or use of such a tool would not be significant enough to justify its use. So no, I think it would not be effective, and I don't think it's on anyone's mind at the moment. What we could see, however, and we are seeing to some extent, is a rise in oil prices due to the conflict and security risk. Rym talked about the Lebanese gas exploration. I think we're likely to see a dampening of investor sentiment in general around East Med gas projects because of this elevated security and conflict risk at the moment. But at the end of the day, unless we see this metastasize, grow, escalate into a wider regional conflict that devours the Gulf region, then I don't think we are going to see a massive impact of the conflict on energy security at the moment.
Tom, I just want to sort of go back in on Block 9. We also have to wait for the final report that Total has to put out. It hasn't put it out yet, but this is sort of initial information that came out today in the Lebanese sort of media. So we just waiting for that final confirmation on what Block 9 has turned out or not from Total.
Yeah, Tom, I just wanted to answer the previous questions about what Gaza would look like the day after the massive Israeli military operation. Obviously, I don't know because it really depends on a million factors, including how well prepared Hamas is, whether it's going to fight to the end, whether the Israelis are what they have in mind. Is it going to be total occupation again, or is it shrinking Gaza even more, creating a greater security zone where people can't go? You level a lot of buildings and you push 2 million people on an even smaller piece of territory. I mean, the scenarios will depend on how the war unfolds. This is not like Mosul after the fight against ISIS or Raqqa, whatever, where you still have an environment around. Yes, you have massive physical damage and so on, but you actually have an ecosystem around. Gaza is completely isolated, its own, and just can't rely on much. A technocratic government. Well, the question has been asked. A number of Palestinians would say, look, we went down this road with Salam Fayyad 20 years ago. There was a big economic agenda. Tony Blair was engaged in that, and lots of others. There was a quartet and so on. But ultimately, the economic benefits were very limited. There was no real political and security concessions on the part of Israel. And as soon as Hamas took over Gaza in its entirety, the Israeli game shifted to essentially squeezing the West Bank and expanding the footprint there. So I think there will be a lot of pushback on the part of the Palestinians saying, it's something technocratic. It's just about rebuilding a few houses and adding some more water pumps and so on. It's not going to make it. You need to create a political horizon. You need to create a new track in which the Americans, the Europeans, others are fully invested to give a political horizon. Obviously, a lot of this will depend on how Israel looks after all that. And it's quite difficult to judge. The difference between Israel and the Palestinian territories is that the Israelis will conduct their own reviews. They will be made public. There will be a lot of blame thrown around and apportionment. It will be a very tense political moment, very traumatic for Israel. So what does this do to the Israeli polity? Does it drive it to even more to the right? Or does it generate some new ideas about how to go about Palestinian statehood and secure a new security order, a framework that provides for that? So I mean, lots of uncertainty in there. It's good to start thinking about it, but the immediate driver will be, what will the Palestinian campaign look like? And that is not an answer that we have any that we can provide.
No, and I think thank you, Emile. And I do want to group up some of them on because some of them are repeating, sort of the implications for the security breach and the intelligence failure. And I don't really want to focus on the intelligence failure because there's lots of theories out there, whether it was deliberate or whatever, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to give credence to those. But there is an expression of which we have coined in one of our previous pieces, the invincibility narrative, and this failure of intelligence, this surprise attack on the Saturday with the devastating results of it. I wouldn't mind just getting a quick sense from the team of what they think that this has on Israel's reputation as an effective security agent, and if it's deemed to be ineffective or less effective, is that an exacerbating position in any case for the region? So, John, we'll go to you first, I think.
I think it makes sense to talk in terms of failure of a security model rather than intelligence failure. That was one component in it, but there were other serious lapses, some of a military nature, many of a policy nature. This conversation, by the way, is tied to the last one, because the Israeli government, they had a plan for Gaza, which was also a security plan, and it was essentially to put it into a sort of oubliette, where it could be pretty much forgotten about. And that, rather harshly put, but that policy had consequences for the amount and the type of security coverage. And I think the shortcomings of that will be pretty ruthlessly exposed in any inquiry. They've also been dramatically evident just from the press coverage of what has happened. So the ease with which that barrier was penetrated, the lack of any kind of QRF, all of that represents a real failure of the model and the failure of the plan for Gaza. So if I may bundle them up together, Tom, the next plan for Gaza, which may be some way out from being formulated, given that the government is in real traumatic shock at the moment, will be essentially another security plan. So the humanitarian concerns that have been articulated quite justifiably by the international community and by Palestinians, I don't think they will be ignored by the Israelis, but they will be secondary to a security plan for the whole of Gaza, which addresses all the shortcomings which have now been exposed. And that may involve some pretty radical permanent presence or very close overwatch of Gaza. It could include, as we've seen them experiment with in other areas, intelligence liaison. And let's not forget, fundamental part of the Oslo Accords and what flowed out of that was that there would be an intelligence and security liaison with, if they can find the body to do that with. So I think these things are all tied together. You're going to see the security model is broken, and it was a security model that drove their policy on Gaza. It will continue to be so, but it will look very different, and it will contain some very different approaches to intelligence and the ability to react quickly.
Excellent. Emile, very quickly, because we are in danger of running over. We've got
nothing to add to that, I think.
Okay. Rym? anything you want to add? No. And Hasan, I'll leave it there as well. Look, for the 22 or so people who we haven't had a chance to get to your questions, I'm really sorry. I hope that I know the team did justice to the ones that I could put to them. I think, and it's difficult to summarize it, but I think, the way that I've picked out the key things that I've picked out is that generally the region wants to will hope for a de-escalation so that it can get back to the business that it was hoping for beforehand, which was development and so on and so forth. Israel, on the other hand, is going to want to punish Hamas, restore deterrence, and then rebuild the sense of security for its people. Hamas expects to be attacked. I think a question many of us have is, what does Hamas get out of this in the long run if it is attacked in the way that the Israelis are claiming that they're going to deal with them? But in the short term, they hope to galvanize regional sympathy and all the things that flow from that. And I think we've all said that there doesn't seem to be at this stage for Iran or Hezbollah in particular, Iran and Hezbollah, an intention to escalate into a regional war, but there is chance for escalation. And on that note, only a short while after the horrific attack of last Saturday, I think we will bring it to an end. And I hope everyone who's been listening and looking in will thank our panel for their valiant and good attempt to bring some light to what is a very tricky circumstance. Thank you very much to our panel.